Okay, welcome everyone. It is 3 o'clock. I'm going to go over some meeting logistics before we get started. So how you can participate today, if you have questions for speakers, type them into the chat. We're going to have a designated Q&A at the end of all 3 speakers today. So it'll be useful if you do have a question to post the name of the speaker in front of the question, so that way we know who it needs to be proctored to once we get to the Q&A session. We'll keep track of all of them as they come into the chat box. You can also use the chat for comments and you can respond to presentations. There's also a reactions feature in the sample here on your Zoom ribbon bar. You should be able to use that as well. If you need assistance, technical assistance related to Zoom, you can message any of the 2. There's 2 PSU support people on the call right now, so we can help. Okay, continuing education. We have California Department of Pesticide Regulation. That should say DPR, not CCA there. Sorry about that. But California Department of Pesticide Regulation, we have 1.5 hours of other. How you get this credit. You must be here for the duration of the event, and you have to answer the live poll questions that get popped up on your screen when we're right after the speaker is done. If you can't, for some reason, see the poll questions, just put your answers in chat, or just say I can't see them in chat, so we just know that you're there. A link will be emailed to you at the end of today that has an exam. You want to pay attention to these poll questions because those will be the same exact questions that are on that exam. You have 1 week to take that exam. You've got to pass it by 70%, and that's how you get your credit. I will send you your certificate once you pass and your notification within about a week after the deadline. And just to note, if you're sitting next to someone else in your room watching this on a computer screen, only 1 person per device can get credit. So that person either needs to log in by phone or another device. CCA again, just like the previous couple days, we have pest management hours today. A QR code will be displayed at the end of the presentations. You can scan with your phone. If you have any problems, just email A&R program support and we'll get you added to the list. And with that, I think I can turn it over to Jan to get us started for today.
Thank you, Kelly. I want to welcome everybody here today. If this is your first day attending our week-long symposium webinar series, we're glad you could join us. If you've been attending all along or for any of the prior days, I apologize for some of this repetitive introduction information. And just to introduce myself, I'm Jan Gonzalez. I am a program coordinator and community education specialist with the University of California Cooperative Extension here in San Diego County. I am currently managing the Climate Resilient Agriculture program, and this is supported, as well as this event, as from funding from the County of San Diego's Climate Action Plan program. So we appreciate their support. We appreciate all of your support for being here and your interest. As Kelly said, we have program support staff here herself, as well as Quinn, to help with any of your challenges, and they've been part of all the logistics for this event. So thank you very much. And I'm trying to think if there was anything else. I think that's about it. We've got some great presentations lined up today, and we hope you enjoy. There's links in the chat box for you to view the agenda, as well as the speakers' biographies. And we will chat more soon. So our first speaker up is Chris McDonald. He is the Inland and Desert Natural Resources Advisor with UC Cooperative Extension in San Bernardino and San Diego County, Riverside. San Bernardino, Riverside, and San Diego and Imperial counties. He's also a county co-director for San Bernardino County, and he's going to talk to us today about weed management and the impacts of changing climate and extreme weather. So thank you for being here, Chris, and I'm ready to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jan. Okay. Jan, we're good on my screen?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, so as Jan mentioned, I'll be talking about weed management, and climate change, and extreme weather. And I only have 15 minutes, and this probably should take about an hour or so. So we're going to do a lot of cramming in here. But I think one of the most important things about this is that the theme for today is that the university is not only stranger than we imagine, but it's stranger than we can imagine. So what is the climate of California? California has this unique Mediterranean climate. It's found in only 5 places in the world. And these are probably some of the 5 best places to visit because they have excellent weather. So what does our weather look like? Our climate, we have cool, wet winters and hot, dry summers. So every summer we get very little rain, as seen in this graph here, and every winter we get a moderate amount of rain and we don't get very many frosts. So that cool, wet winter, hot, dry summer. And what this means for our weeds, one, is that there is a strong and significant weeding season or growing season in the winter and spring, and there's not a lot of new weeds popping up in the summer unless we have irrigation. And 2, the other thing is that we have 5 months of rainfall from November to March or so to get our normal average amount for the year. So if we miss a couple of large storms for the year, then we're going to be below average in most years, just because we have this really short compressed time for when the rain comes our way. And then after that, we're pretty much missing all the storms. On top of that, the amount of rainfall that we receive in Southern California is very variable. We have one of the most variable precipitation patterns on Earth. And I've got 2 graphs here to kind of give you an example of what that looks like. So here's a picture of the annual rainfall at Lake Cuyamaca from the mid-60s to about now. And you can see that the graph is bouncing around all over the place every single year. In a drought at Cuyamaca, we're looking at 10 inches of rain at the low, and we're looking at over 70 inches of rain in a really wet year. So we're looking at a factor of 7 times different between a drought and a flood. And comparing that to Chicago, which is over here on the right, we're looking at an average of about 30 inches of rain, which is about the same as Cuyamaca. But you can see that the really wet years in Chicago and the really dry years in Chicago are falling pretty much between 30 and 40 inches of rain. They're not getting 70 inches a year in a wet year, nor are they getting 10 in a low year. So you can see that in California, we're just getting a lot more extreme rainfall in year to year. And you can see that it's also bouncing around quite a bit here. So we have a year where we have 70 inches of rain at Cuyamaca, then down to 20, a drought, then back up to 70, and then back down to 20. So we're going drought, rain, drought, rain, drought, rain in just a series of a couple of years, where you don't see that too much in Chicago. Looking closer to home for some of you, at the airport, right next to the coast or the convention center, depending on what you're interested in. Same type of pattern emerges, except the amounts are lower, less than 5 inches in a drought year near the airport and 20 or more inches in a wet year. So that same kind of rainfall bouncing around is pretty much our normal average. So what will the climate of California look like in the future? Well, the first thing to point out is that we're already starting to get hotter. Death Valley last year reached a new, possibly modern record of 130 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's pretty likely that we're going to be getting hotter. But then we also, there's lots of different ways that we can kind of pull out what the climate's going to look like. Most of the climate change models suggest that California is going to be hotter than compared to decades past. And that pretty much seems like a no-brainer, since it's already getting hotter right now than it's been in decades past. And the difference here is whether how much emissions we have globally will affect how hot it does get. So under a moderate emission scenario here in the center, high temperatures will be moderately high, but under a high emission scenario, our high temperatures can be very high. And on top of that, hotter is drier. So when it is hotter outside, plants will need more water to grow the same amount. So as we get higher temperatures, we have more water evaporating up from the soil. So even though the same amount of water is falling on the soil, more will be lost. through evaporation. And when it's hotter, more water is lost through the leaves of a plant as it keeps itself cool and as it grows through transpiration. So the plant will be losing more water as it grows. So you're losing more water through the soil through evaporation, and you're losing more water through the plant through transpiration, and it means more water loss, even though the only thing that's increased is just the temperature. Looking at some of the climate change models with regards to future precipitation, they suggest a less clear pattern with precipitation. Some of the models suggest that it could rain more, but this, I will admit, is the least likely outcome. Some of the models suggest that it could rain the same amount, and some of the models suggest it could rain less. And in all of these scenarios, precipitation is likely to be more variable. So that seems to be one of the common things, is that the California precipitation regime will be more variable than our currently already extreme variable weather and rainfall. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk, I'm going to break this up into 3 different scenarios of what might happen to our weeds when, if and when it gets hotter and wetter, or if it's hotter and the same, or if it's hotter and drier. And the hotter and wetter is indicated by the green up arrow. Hotter and the same is this yellow center, this yellow flat arrow, and then hotter and drier is the down arrow. And again, in all these scenarios, it's likely that our weather events will be more extreme. So looking at the first scenario, hotter and wetter, if it's going to be in hotter and wetter, then I think the weed community should change in 3 distinct ways. The first is that the weeds are likely to grow larger. And this kind of makes sense. Weeds that receive more water will grow larger and produce more seeds each year. So more water, bigger plants. This kind of makes sense in our gardens. So because of this, your weeding efforts are likely going to need to increase due to this factor. Second scenario, hotter and wetter. Or first scenario, hotter and wetter, but second factor that should change is that the number of weeds will likely increase. And this again makes sense. With more rainfall, the number of individual weeds should increase. So as it rains more in a really wet year, we see a lot more seeds germinating, and we just get more weeds per unit area. So this makes sense that if it rains more, we should see more weeds. And again, this means that your weeding efforts are going to likely increase under this climate change scenario. And the last effect of this is that the weed species you have should more or less stay about the same. So many of the weeds that we have in Southern California have been here for a long time, and many are already adapted to drought. Because our climate is so variable, if there were a weed species out there that just couldn't tolerate growing in less than 10 inches of rain a year, then it's probably not going to survive the normal droughts that we already have, which, you know, like this year, we're at less than 5 inches of rain in most parts of Southern California. So those species just aren't going to germinate, and then eventually will peter out over time. So we should see minimal rain shifts if we are living in a hotter and wetter California in the future, which again should have minimal effects on your weed management program. So moving on to scenario 2, where it's hotter and the rainfall stays the same, then we should see the weed community change in, again, 3 distinct ways. One, we should see smaller individual weeds. And I mentioned this earlier, hotter is drier. So with higher temperatures and the same amount of water, the plant is going to need more water to grow the same size because it's hotter. So if it's not getting more water, then that plant should be, all other things being equal, then that plant should be a little bit smaller in the future. So your weed program should remain about the same because it does take about the same amount of effort to kill a medium-sized weed than it does to kill a slightly smaller medium-sized weed. Next effect of this is that we should have less weeds. So again, if we have higher temperatures and plants need more water, then we should get a little bit less weeds growing out on the landscape than in a year like if we had a big rainfall year like this one. So again, your weed program might decrease a little, but it's still going to take quite a bit of work to kill a field of weeds like this. And the last effect of this is that we should see only a few new weed species. So like I mentioned earlier, there could be some weed species shifting their ranges into more dry areas, but they're probably not a lot. And so your weed program costs might change a little bit, but they shouldn't change too much. So In our third climate change scenario, if it's going to be hotter and drier, then we should see 4 changes in the weed community. And the first one makes sense. The weeds should be smaller. Again, hotter means drier and drier means drier. So if it's hotter and drier, then the weeds should be smaller. And your weed program might decrease a little because it's a little bit easier to kill small weeds, but the weeds will still be there. Second effect of this is that there should be new weed species occurring in your area. Like I said, there's many drought tolerant weeds in Southern California: mustard, spurges, grasses, knapweeds, tumbleweeds, thistles. And some of these species are going to be better competitors against the suite weeds that are already on your property. So the end effect of this is that your weeding program might stay the same depending on how these shifts go, and they might increase as well. Another effect of this is that the weeds could be more numerous. And so if these drought tolerant weeds are more abundant on your property than the current weeds, you might get smaller but more drought tolerant weeds. And a way to kind of drive this home is to think about wild oat. So wild oat is a drought tolerant weed, but it's not a super drought tolerant weed. It's kind of like one of those middle ground weeds. And it can grow, 3 to 5 feet tall. It's a relatively big plant, grow about 1, sometimes 2 feet wide. And now if it were drier and it were replaced by something like a red brome, which is definitely smaller, grows a foot, maybe 2 feet at most, and it's much skinnier, grows maybe 6 inches wide, you can cram in a whole lot more red brome plants in the same area that only one wild oat can grow. So where one wild oat grows, you might have 6 or maybe even 8 or 10 red brome plants growing in that same exact area. So your weeding program might stay the same, or counterintuitively, you might actually have to do more work killing these weeds because you have more drought tolerant weeds on your property. And the last effect of this is that the weed populations should fluctuate more. This makes sense. If rainfall is more variable, weed populations are going to be bouncing up and down. But I do want to mention that it's really important to be controlling weeds during a drought. So when we have a long-term drought like this, in some years with low rainfall, the only plants that are going to seed are our weeds. So if the weeds are producing seed every year during a drought and the natives aren't producing seeds, then when we do have a year of above average rainfall, then there's going to be a lot more weed seeds in the soil ready to germinate when we do eventually get out of a drought. And one of the things about your weed program fluctuating more, so going from something like an above average year to a below average year to a moderate year, can your budget handle these type of changes when you're weeding? So for example, can you convince your supervisor or your funders to spend more money to do weeding during a drought? Because weeding during a drought can be very efficient. You're getting some of those last weeds that are growing, and it can be highly effective because you are getting more bang for your buck. There's less weeds that you have to kill. And then the other question is, when a big rainfall year comes after a drought, will you be able to handle the increase in work when more weeds germinate? So controlling weeds during a flood year can be difficult too. So kind of summarizing these 3 scenarios, if it's going to be hotter and wetter, then there's likely to be increases in your weed management program, and that makes sense. If it's going to be hotter and the same, you're mostly going to have similar weed management program, might decrease a little bit. If it's going to be hotter and drier, you could have a similar weed management program that you do now, or possibly counterintuitively have increases in your weed management program. If we have long-term droughts, then we should see weed declines in severe droughts. Or the question is, can you manage weeds during a drought? And your success will really depend on how you manage the weeds during a drought. And here's the California Drought Monitor. The whole state is currently in a drought right now. And with that, I will thank you and take some questions, or take the questions.
Yes, so you guys should see a poll on your screen. Participants, there are 3 questions, so make sure you answer all 3. Go ahead and submit, especially if you want DPR credit. We'll give you about 30 seconds here. Then we'll close and then go over the results once people submit. So I see that one person has submitted, but there's 3 questions, so I'll give you some more time. Okay, I'm gonna end and share the results. So if you don't mind going over them real quick, that'd be great.
Okay, so first question, true, excellent. Yeah, weeding during a drought is great. There's usually less plants out there, and it's even more important to get those weeds during a drought because, like I said, when we do have a year with above average rainfall, those are the freshest seeds. So we want to make sure we eliminate those seeds from the soil. Second question, yeah, good job. If the rainfall becomes more variable, it's going to be harder to budget and implement long-term weed control projects. It'll be harder to convince people during the middle of a drought, yeah, we need a lot of money to keep controlling these weeds each and every year, because 1, the drought will eventually end, and 2, we want to make sure we get rid of all those seeds. And then in question 3, in a year with above average rainfall, of course, you need to increase the number of times the weeds are treated. 2019 was a great year for wildflowers, but it was also a big year for weeds. And a lot of land managers were just under a giant pile of weeds because there was so much rain in 2019. So thanks.
Thank you, Chris. We really appreciate that overview and those great scenarios shared. Hope that was helpful for everyone. So up next, I'd like to introduce Matt Daugherty. He's a Cooperative Extension Specialist and entomologist based out of UC Riverside, and he'll be talking to us about insect pest management and the impacts of changing climate and extreme weather in that arena. So Matt, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you guys see my screen, hopefully?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So thanks, Jan and Kelly, for help putting this together. Yeah, so I was asked to kind of give you a little perspective on the implications for climate change and extreme weather on the management of insect pests. And this is actually an issue that we know quite a bit about. So as a result, I'm going to generalize a lot probably, and actually not necessarily take a California-centric view with some of this stuff, just to give you a pretty broad overview of kind of what we think is going on. And so I'll start off with the most general point, which is that insects and their relatives really are very sensitive to local environmental conditions. And so, right, they're ectotherms. And so temperature plays a really big role in a bunch of different aspects of their biology, but also other aspects of weather and climate can influence it directly in a big way as well. And the other thing to keep in mind, right, is that especially herbivorous insects, they can respond strongly to plant quality. So any climate effects that are actually impacting the plant, many of them can also translate to impacts on insect biology. So there's theoretically a bunch of stuff going on in some cases simultaneously related to climate impacting insect biology. And so here's just a few of the really common things that have been shown, you know, in many, many studies of many, many, many insects relating the effects of climate to their biology. So yeah, right, because they're ectotherms, their development rates, number of generations, oftentimes are strongly dependent on temperature. And so in this upper figure, this is sort of the standard development curve we see, where there's generally a positive effect of temperature on development rate, faster and faster development at higher temperatures up until some point, right? And then eventually they sort of bump into a wall beyond which higher temperatures are actually detrimental to them. And that's a common thing with a lot of these responses. Temperature and CO2 also affect reproduction in various ways. Their survival rate of insects can be influenced by a bunch of aspects of climate. And so keep in mind, insects are, you know, generally really small bodied, right? So they can be very sensitive to desiccation. So especially low humidity or high temperature environments can induce a lot of mortality in them. Lots of effects of climate on flight, lots of effects on temperature as well. And again, sort of mostly positive effects on feeding rates, higher temperatures equating to mostly higher feeding rates. So those are some of the direct effects. I mentioned kind of plant mediated effects as well, right? And so it's increasingly clear, Chris touched on this, right, of sort of extreme weather events inducing stressors in plants. So things like drought, for example, we know can trigger bark beetle epidemics. In, say, the Sierra foothills over the last 10 years, we've seen big die-offs because those trees are really stressed. They can't fend off these beetles. We see other things, another group of arthropods, mites, especially spider mites, seem to respond to like drought stress in plants, water stress in plants, or dusty conditions, and that could trigger outbreaks of them, increasing the damage they cause. And then we also see effects of atmospheric CO2, and the conditions in which plants grow can impact their susceptibility to damage. And oftentimes, higher CO2 impacts plant quality in a way that actually insects actually compensate by feeding more, so you get more damage in those environments compared to sort of ambient or low CO2 environments. And then the other point to make about this, and I don't have time to go into this, but a lot of my research lately, or actually for a while, is focused on this disease in grapevines called Pierce disease, which is caused by this bacterium, which is spread by leafhopper insects. And I bring this up because I think it's an example where the more we learn about this system, the more we realize that different aspects of climate, especially temperature, but also precipitation, really influence all aspects of this disease. So the insects, the bacterium, the plants themselves, as well as the diseases in the plants, are also impacted. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, which kind of complicates our responses, especially as conditions continue to change. So I kind of touched on, how climate underpins insect biology. As a result, entomologists have thought pretty long and hard, actually, about what we're likely to see in terms of insects responding to climate change. And so I'm showing you sort of the consensus, sort of four broad categories of responses that are expected. And in some cases, actually, we're already seeing. So one response might be that we're seeing insects in areas we hadn't seen them before necessarily. Another would be that some of those traits I talked about, those life history traits like reproduction rates or number of generations, stuff like that, being impacted by a changing climate. We also might see changes in the patterns of abundance of insects when they're actually active out in the field, bigger peaks in activity at different times of year than occurred in the past, stuff like that. And then finally, the last potential set of responses would be those, sort of altered interactions between the insect herbivores, the pests, and their plants, as I already kind of alluded to, but even also climate change has the potential to impact their interactions with the natural enemies, the predators and parasitoids that attack them. And I want to kind of stop for a second and just point out that those responses, those theoretical responses to climate change, are not some hypothetical thing that's way out on the horizon. There's actually quite a bit of evidence in some cases of these phenomena already having occurred over the last several decades. So one study from a few years ago looked at where insects are being found kind of over time, going back decades. They actually looked at a bunch of different crop pests, part of them including insect pests, and found that there's been this poleward shift. So in the north, there's kind of more and more of them being found up north than they had been in the past, and the same thing in the south, southern hemisphere further to the south. The reason being, right, is that as things warm, those environments are warming quicker. They're becoming more favorable for some of these pests, insects included, to sort of march down into those new environments. Another study took a little bit different tack, and they kind of identified a few dozen really important, widely distributed insect pests of ag systems, and then dug up a bunch of information over the last few decades, published studies, and looked in that information to see whether there's evidence of responses to changing climate in these pests. And they found that absolutely there was. Of the 31 species that they found enough information on, 94% of them, 29 of 31, showed at least some indication, oftentimes multiple indications of responding to climate change. The most common of these are those range shifts, the range changes that I talked about. Those other broad categories I mentioned were less frequent, but still not rare. But the other point here is shown in this middle graph, where what they found is more often than not, compared to sort of historic patterns, there's an increase in activity and increased damage for many of these pest insects. About twice as often they were seeing more damage or more activity than they were seeing declines in activity or damage. So really, hopefully sort of reinforcing this idea that these are real things. They've been going on for a while already, and it will continue to be a challenge for us moving forward. Okay, so let's maybe dig into I gave you those broad categories of responses, and I'll touch on a few of the slight more specifics now. And this first one I talked about, and a couple times now noted we're already seeing some of this. And that's this idea that we're expecting to see new insect pests in areas that we hadn't necessarily seen them before, or maybe they were there occasionally, but not necessarily very, very impactful or very damaging. There's expected to be more of these establishment of pests, especially in what are kind of more northern or say high elevation, cooler climates. The reason being is, again, as those conditions change in those environments, and again, northern latitudes tend to be warming faster than at other areas, making them more favorable, more hospitable for these insects to establish in a way that they couldn't have in the past. I do want to, like, one caveat here though is, and this I think a little bit missed in some of the popular press treatment of this issue, is that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be all insect pests all the time everywhere. There are limits to what these insects can tolerate, right? And so if you think about it, an area that's already really hot and dry, if it becomes even more hot and dry, it's likely to sort of push out even relatively hardy insects. So there is a limit. We're expecting to see certainly expansion into some areas, especially what are currently cooler areas, but some areas we're likely to see some contraction in the distribution of the pests. Okay, does that make sense? All right. So in addition to range changes, another set of predictions relate to kind of patterns of activity or abundance. And we're already, again, seeing some of these. And so one expectation is we're going to see what we call an accelerated phenology for many of these insect pests. So they're getting going a little bit earlier in the season than they had historically. And we certainly see that in a couple of the grapevine pests I've worked on. Along with that, there's the potential for sort of longer growing seasons, right? More favorable warm conditions in the spring and say maybe in the fall, leading to, especially for perennial crops, a longer period of time over the year where they can do okay and grow. Along with that probably carries the risk of allowing these pest species to be out there for longer periods of time. And the problem is that if those two things actually end up unfolding in a particular area for a crop, it likely subjects that crop to more frequent and more severe pest outbreaks. Basically, the insects just have more time to get going, more time to cause damage. Other sets of things that we're expecting, and I kind of touched on these already. It's plausible that with continued climate change, we're going to see more frequent or more severe plant damage, in part due to things like long-term drought triggering some of these pest outbreaks, or water stress in plants subjecting them to more damage. And then also as atmospheric CO2 concentrations increase, it's also plausible in some crop systems, at least, that we'll likely see those crops be more susceptible to herbivory, like I kind of mentioned early on. So all things that, some of this we can deal with, right, with irrigation for irrigated systems. For non-irrigated systems, it's going to be hard to mitigate some of those impacts. And then the last sort of set of predictions relate to the effectiveness of existing control measures. And there's already some evidence that, for example, insecticides, or in some cases pheromones, actually, their effectiveness, how long they're effective for on a plant or out in the field, depends on things like temperature or UV intensity. So higher temperatures, or more intense UV is likely to sort of ratchet back the period over which those products are effective. We're requiring some kind of like on the fly, or at least a little bit more investment in terms of understanding the likely impacts. Likewise, there's likely to be impacts to biocontrol. So the general way, without getting into too much details, the concern here is that if the pest insect is responding to climate change in sort of a different way than, say, the predator or the parasitoids, that can lead to problems and mismatch in terms of not allowing the biocontrol agents to do their job to the extent they could before. And so I'll wrap up just by kind of pointing out, again, these are some very general but also probably relatively common things that'll be needed to respond to these sorts of issues moving forward in insect pest management. And given all of the uncertainty, right, with this, a lot of these things are the devil's in the details about exactly what's going to happen in terms of changing climate and where, how the crop is affected, how the insects are affected. As a result of that uncertainty, it just really, if anything, increases our reliance on monitoring, putting the traps out there, doing other monitoring to figure out where these new pests are, when they're active, kind of what's going on, and then adjusting management accordingly. That may involve, as I kind of alluded to, altering things like treatment timings if the pest's phenology is altered, or maybe if it's a longer kind of growing season, it might require additional treatments from more intensive chemical control or mating disruption programs. I mean, I don't have time to get into the details of this, but there's already certainly big impacts of climate on just which kinds of cultivars or varieties of a given crop you're going to grow in a particular area. That has implications for pests, specifically if there's differences in the susceptibility of those different cultivars to pests and diseases. So adjusting for that is going to be something that's going to require a big investment in time and research. And then finally, I kind of touched on biocontrols, and changing climate may impact when we are releasing control agents and augmentative programs, or maybe we need to go and hunt for other species and then use those compared to ones that maybe are losing their effectiveness now. So some kind of open-ended questions about this stuff, but things that are potentially important. So I'll wrap up there and give you guys a chance to go over a couple of the questions.
Great. You should see that poll up now. And again, there are 3 questions, so make sure you use the scroll toggle on the right side to answer all 3 questions. Again, I'll give you about 1.5 minutes, and then we'll go over the answers.
Okay, so yeah, number 1, which of the following is not a likely impact of climate change on insects? Fewer outbreaks, more consistent patterns of activity. Absolutely. If anything, as I said, for a variety of reasons, we're expecting to see maybe more outbreaks, less consistent patterns of activity. They're likely to be shifting around. And again, it kind of depends on a particular insect and crop, but that's, I think, a good counter to what we'd expect to see. All these other things are absolutely already being supported based on available evidence. This one is, it looks like you guys had answered more evenly. That's not surprising. That's a little bit of a tricky question. This is climate change and more extreme weather will consistently favor insect pests. And what the question was intended to get at was sort of what I mentioned early on in a couple of places, where there are still upper limits to what insects can tolerate in terms of temperature or any of these variables. So while it's true in a lot of situations, warming, especially in the near term, is going to favor them. For example, if things get too hot, say in Death Valley, even more so than now, any insect in that environment is going to have a hard time. So the correct answer to this would have been false, although I totally get why many of you picked true. The third question, which of the following will not be required to effectively respond to climate change effects on ag? And absolutely reduce reliance on biocontrol. Biocontrol is likely to be impacted in systems where it's already really important, right? The details are going to shift in terms of what we may want to do, but it does not necessarily mean we're going to just throw our hands up and give up on it. On the contrary, if anything, it's just going to require a little bit more effort to figure out how to make it work.
Great. Thank you, Matt. That was really interesting. A great overview, but really interesting on not just the impacts of the changing climate to pests, but the impacts to management and what we'll need to be looking out for, be prepared for. So appreciate that. Got a couple of questions. So, hi there, Chris. So this is for Matt. If the range changes are the most commonly found change, what types of subtropical pests should we keep an eye on that may expand northward into our area? South American palm weevil, other weevils?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something that's very much on our minds. So what's implicit in your question, right, is that this is sort of natural spread in from adjacent areas, which totally makes sense. So as a result of that, like already some of the stuff that are on our radar. So my colleague Mark Hoddle's worked a lot on avocado sea weevil, for example, which is Mexico and Central America, especially. Just given the fact that, we grow a lot of avocado here, the climate already is relatively similar here, maybe a little bit drier, but similar. And so that's already likely to be a risk. Similar things with some of the mites on avocado that are present in Mexico, and there's concerns that they'll become, scale insects rather, become introduced and established in California. That's another sort of thing. Asian citrus psyllid up until a few years ago was on the same list. Right now, it's been here for a while. So those are all kind of the natural, maybe some combination of natural and or assisted spread from our neighboring countries. That's sort of irrespective necessarily of climate change. That's sort of just proximity. And the reason being is that, like, Southern California, our climate's already relatively similar to some of those areas, especially sort of northern Mexico. And so we don't need any climate change in order for things to make it more favorable. South American palm weevil, you mentioned, has actually already been introduced and established here. I think where the issue becomes a little bit more directly relevant to climate change is like the difference between Southern California and the Central Valley, and especially the difference up in Northern California and Southern California. We have some pests down here that pretty clearly do not do very well up there yet. Given some of the change, Chris did a really nice job of sort of laying out what we're expecting for climate change. It's very plausible some of the stuff we have in Southern California, which is really marginal in Central or Northern California, is going to do a lot better in the future up there. So I guess that's kind of where I would leave. The reason being is sorry, not to go on too much. One quick point is that a lot of the sort of natural spread stuff, which is tied to, perhaps rain shifts, is really swamped out by human assisted spread, where we're moving invasive species around, oftentimes incidentally. So while your question's totally legitimate and something that's on our radar, we're just worried about stuff coming from, Asia or somewhere else, which is not necessarily anything directly to do with climate.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. So a question for Niamh. How can hedgerows be used in a way that does not encourage pest populations?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. And so there's actually some research on field edge boundaries, and a lot of it is tied into food safety, because it's kind of crazy when, you grow a load of lettuce or leafy greens. If anything comes near it and there's like a little tiny piece of poop on a little tiny piece of lettuce, like all of a sudden, like a huge proportion of the crop has to be destructed. And that's obviously not good and not fun for anybody involved. And so I have had colleagues that have looked into, because hedgerows obviously can create huge amounts of biodiversity, and then they can have kind of other beneficial, from like a non-vertebrate pest, but from maybe an invertebrate pest, they can house maybe beneficial insects and plants and things like that. But they also can harbor lots of wildlife. But on the other hand as well, they could be used to encourage, maybe raptors, birds of prey, like raptors and owls and things like that. But do they really decrease the population of rodents? Not so much. The thing about rodents is that they're, especially pest rodents, they're what we call R-selected species. And so they're kind of just the pain in everybody's backside, because they can live anywhere. So like these kind of rodents, they can live in the penthouse or they can live in the basement, and they can basically live in between and have serious amounts of babies, essentially. So any kind of predators that would use a hedgerow wouldn't have the ability to decrease the rodent populations below any acceptable threshold. And to be fair, in some of these crops, the threshold is this. And so if your threshold is 0, well, then you're not going to have any predators to even start with. So it's really complicated, and it would be interesting to look at. But I don't know how you could build a hedgerow that's something like that a vertebrate animal, and maybe not necessarily a pest, but a vertebrate animal wouldn't want to live in.
Okay, thank you, Niamh. I had a question regarding, I know with one of the strategies in addressing climate change or carbon sequestration and reducing greenhouse gas emissions is composting and mulching, soil health, improving soil health. But I'm wondering if those applications, either in the field or in processing those products, if there's an increase in pests like rats or other vertebrate pests.
Yeah, if it's food compost, absolutely. Especially like even if you think about from your own backyard, we generally recommend that you don't compost food if you're worried about vertebrate pests like rats, because it will increase them. And then the other thing that we know from at least home composting is that it actually decreases, or it's linked to poor health of species like coyotes, because the coyotes forage in the compost and they pick up all sorts of viruses and bacteria in the compost and all the different things that are like around it. And so it's interesting, like there's always like a knock-on, like an almost like an unintentional knock-on effect of some of these strategies. But yeah, it can increase vertebrate pests. But the thing about compost though is that the compost grows the crop, and that's what they're really going to come for. They're not maybe going to be able to sustain themselves on compost alone, but it's the crop that comes after that they're most interested in.
Okay, Great, thank you. And I'm just curious, with on the video that you shared from Australia, was that in the general area where there were the huge wildfires? Or, I mean, I was just wondering if there was any relation to that.
It's actually
wildfire
related to
activity.
rainfall. And so
Oh,
it's
okay.
actually related to rainfall. So like, it's not just fires, because we have all these different extreme weather events. And so we actually, a lot of the rodent outbreaks and cycles that we know of are actually more related to rain events than to fire events. And what we're seeing with fire is that after fire, actually from a wildlife perspective, like a vertebrate wildlife perspective, it actually recovers quite quickly. Where you're seeing larger vertebrate like deer, mountain lions, things like that, like in the environment almost immediately straight after the fires, which is very, very interesting. And so while fires can temporarily shift wildlife, they can also come back very, very quickly. But in Australia, it's actually related to the amount of rainfall in a certain month. And what happens is that it promotes the growth of natural food sources for the mice. And so it extends that breeding period. And I mean, it's literally currently right now raining mice essentially in Australia, parts of Australia. It's insane.
Wow. Wow.
Let's hope that doesn't happen to us. I already have enough
Right.
problems. I don't need a mouse plague on top of them.
No. No, we don't know that. Okay, let me see. Any other questions? Chat.
Hey, Jan, can I put Chris on the spot a bit?
Sure.
Chris, I'm curious about, and you sort of touched on this, but kind of like the timing of rainfall events. And I know for weeds, right, there's sort of early season, later season weeds and stuff. And have you seen anything that indicates there's enough information yet in some of the climate change predictions to know whether or not that's the timing event is resolved enough to predict whether or not there'll be a need to focus in on certain types of weed taxa? See what I mean?
Yeah, there's been some work on this, not a ton yet, and timing, and in California it gets tricky because there's kind of, even though we only have one growing season, there's kind of two weed seasons. So there's those weeds that germinate when it's cool and wet, so like late fall, early winter, and then there's those weeds that germinate when it's warmer and wetter, but it's still cool, like February, March. So you can shift. So if you get a really cold, wet rain, you can shift to those weed species that are definitely much more cold tolerant. And then if you get more of the kind of a warmer rain, so like if we had more November rain rather than January rain, you'll definitely see a shift in the weed community compared to more January rain compared to more like February or March rain. And then those March and April storms kind of release all of those summer annuals like goat's head and tumbleweed and things like that. So, what year was it that we had a really bad tumbleweed? Was it 2019, 2017? We had a couple of like freak late season storms, and the tumbleweed was, 6 feet wide and 6 feet tall and the size of, mini cars. So yes, there can be, very huge shifts, but it really gets at a fine scale of rain at Thanksgiving versus rain at Christmas. And those are just two completely different weed communities that'll come up at those two rainfall events.
Got it. Okay.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other questions, so we're going to go ahead and close it up. We went a little bit over, but that was expected, and we appreciate all of the talks today, all of our presenters very much, and thank you for sticking around for the Q&A. If anything else comes up during our breakout groups, we'll be sure to reach out to you if we need some help with the answers. But we are going to go ahead and break into some small group discussions. And we will chat more about what are the biggest concerns that you have with pest management, with considering climate change or extreme weather events or not. But we'll hear we want to hear from you and find out what are your biggest concerns or issues or challenges that you're having with that. So Kelly is going to break us up, I think, into small groups, and then she'll give us about a minute, a minute or two, 5-minute heads up that we're going to come back, and then we'll close out the session.
Yeah, you'll get a 5-minute warning, and then a 2-minute warning perhaps, and then a 30-second warning. And then can you want to list the moderators again, just so people know?
Yes. Yes, so we have some folks who are going to help us out with facilitating the small group discussions. Annika Neighbors, Esther Musase, Christian Salgado, Nikki Anderson, is she on today? I didn't think, and then myself and Jerry Spinelli. So as needed, depending on how many small groups we break into, they will kind of facilitate the discussion and moderate that. Thank you very much to all of them for their assistance. And then if you can just send me the notes when you're done, email them to me, that would be appreciated. Okay, there we go. Thank you, everyone, for the conversation that you had in your breakout groups. We appreciate everyone staying through that, who was able to join in. And I want to thank everyone again for being here today and for participating in the symposium. I know Kelly's got the continuing education information up there on the screen again. I just want to remind everyone, we are recording all of the sessions throughout the week, and we'll get those processed and up on our YouTube channel as soon as possible, probably within a couple of weeks. And we'll certainly inform you when those are ready and available. So thank you again to all of our speakers and to all of you for participating. Tomorrow, on our last day, we'll be starting at 9 a.m., but at the same link. Kelly, anything else?
Yeah, I'm just going to go over the continuing education briefly as a reminder. You'll get an exam link emailed to you by tomorrow morning. I probably will get it today. I'm going to stay on and get it out, but just in case, don't worry about it if you don't receive it until tomorrow morning. You have 1 week to take that exam. Results, including certificates, will be sent to you probably within 1 week of that, probably sooner based on our numbers. I'll probably get it to you pretty fast. Again, 1 user per device is allowed. There's that code. Go ahead and take a picture. If you don't have the app, you can just email me and I'll get you signed up. And that was it.
Thank you to all of our facilitators and everyone participating. Just really appreciate your participation. Hope to see you tomorrow.